Thank you. So welcome to the delayed, but very happily delayed, but those presentations were wonderful, panel on unlocking sustainability triggered innovation. We're going to start with an introduction by Christian Matic, and then we'll have a panel discussion which will take up your coffee break and then some, but we'll probably get on. I hope it will be just as invigorating as the coffee break would have been. And we'll go on to closing plenary, I would suspect around 10 past 12. So Christian, please.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to introduce this panel because I think one of the things that I have been looking at the conference is that you are all economists. So you might be a little bit triggered by my presentation that doesn't have any single economic indicator. So why is that? Because I'm currently working at the Joint Research Center in Seville in the Innovation Policy Unit. But my background, even when I was an economist many years ago, I have that dark side. I moved 20 years ago to climate change, working with geographers, sociologists, and also with people that understand how innovation works in terms of systemic approach. So in general terms, that is the Sustainability Transitions Framework and the current discussion on transformative innovation. And that is what I'm bringing today as a provocation in terms of this overall concept about navigating opportunity spaces to link climate adaptation. Sorry, mitigation is not longer a big issue now. We are into climate adaptation and innovation. So for doing that, I'm going to use the material that we have developed over the last 2 years on this interplay between climate adaptation and innovation policy with different communities, including UNEP and including the Brussels community, but also other communities working in Africa and in Latin America about trying to explore opportunities in innovation through the implementation. There's a lot of suggestions and recommendations about new policies in your presentations, but nothing about what you do with what you have, how you manage a portfolio of actions with the current policies and the current resources. So that is kind of my provocation about. So let's start. So this is the situation in Europe. I'm going to be short. So we need to address complex systems, but also we, as part of the geopolitical situations, there is a rethinking about Europe's position, not only in terms of like leadership in some topics, but also in secure Europe's position in terms of globalization. I listened a couple of days ago about multilateralism, so that is changing. But also that complexity involves multiple instruments that needs to face the innovation divide. Some regions are lagging behind, but also some sectors, like the automotive, for example, but AI as well. And what does it mean in terms of industrial transformation? So in order to change that perspective, we need to anticipate and try to move forward with new frameworks that address these kind of complexity issues. How we are trying to see that in the Commission, but also with regions, and that is going to be one of my examples. We are trying to raise awareness about the importance of addressing systemic transformation in terms of climate adaptation by addressing what you already know, this kind of big challenge about competitiveness in Europe. So you might be aware about the Draghi report and all this kind of discussion about what does it mean investment. And this is something particularly important in a conference that I have been listening a lot of presentation on funding mechanism and too little about investment and models that I think we need to think more about that. And in terms of that, there is a scope of opportunities that we need to analyze in terms of transformative approaches, but also the place-based approach. Europe is very diverse and there are different opportunities, and we need to take into consideration that diversity. So what does it mean, navigating opportunity space? What we are trying to say. So this is the first question, how we can leverage actually the interplay between innovation and climate adaptation to unlock those diverse opportunities. What does it mean? It means that sometimes we do not have investment or funding for climate adaptation. we do have that for innovation and regional development. So we need to explore those interlinks to make it happen. So combining the different opportunities in sectors and topics, and also in the portfolio approach in order to make those connections, rather than just suggesting new regulations and policies, what we can do with what we have. And this is particularly important when we are thinking about cities or regions and the multi-level governance logic of any single topic that you mentioned today or yesterday about mobility, housing, etc. We need to understand how to navigate the implementation and also working with the private sector. And that means opportunities, trying to see how we connect the dots. So, but we talk about interplay between transformative innovation and climate adaptation and transformative and policy mixes, but are we trying to tweak the edges of a broken system? Is this another branding? Are we really willing to confront the truth about that we need a radical transformation in terms of climate adaptation and bringing innovation? What if our understanding of transformative innovation is not transformative at all? And that is very important because even the sustainability transitions community is trying to avoid using sustainability as a word. It's kind of an old concept now. Okay, we need to boost that concept with other elements in terms of the radicality of the change that we need to address. So this is what happens sometimes. We have all these kind of isolated conversations: climate, industry, innovation, agri-food, energy. But the complex systems means that we need to integrate that. So what we are trying to see is how we can facilitate a kind of a common point to connect those isolated conversations. So what we call is that contextualizing that into a particular system approach. How we do that? And I'm going to take the example of what we are doing right now with 5 different countries. We are talking about these topics: regenerative urban planning, water energy nexus, blue-green infrastructure, sustainable tourism. We need to identify these kind of topics that enable us to connect the dots. And that is a way to use a portfolio approach, because you can have the business model, project, investment, finance, and also economic development. That is a way to start a conversation even from a local point of view, something that can have a conversation for a long time, for the following 20 years. I haven't seen today, or the first day I've been here, anything about foresight or visions. So I just wonder why. Okay, so how we address this kind of conversation in a kind of a long-term transformation, not what we need to do next, but in the following 20 years. But in order to do that, we need to anchor those conversations indeed in priorities and long-term implementation of strategies that is both public and private. We are going that direction: competitiveness, industry, new jobs, sustainability, where we are going. That can be only consolidated if we use the kind of existing plans, strategies, and rules, but in a kind of an integrated way with the private sector and industry. There's no way that we can do that only with public funding. So investment, but also alignment in terms of how we can develop new capacities for emerging sector, but also another concept that I haven't seen here, phasing out of the old sectors. It's not possible getting to a climate adaptation and sustainability without this kind of approach. And for doing that, we need to consolidate that only with interregional cooperation. The value chain, the sectors are place-based, but are also disseminated over Europe. It's a hard decision sometimes in order to pick up winners. This is the current discussion that we are having about competitiveness and keeping the climate change discussion. So I'm just going to finalize with a small example of what we are doing. So there is a book with this explanation. That is what I'm selling right now. So, so the example is what we call the preparatory action, but it's on place-based transformative innovation. We are working as part of cooperation with the European Parliament, what we call preparatory action, because we are trying to get evidence for the legislation of the future. So we are helping different regions all over Europe to work in topics like food, digital health, mobility, but also climate adaptation. And in the climate adaptation topic, we are trying to address this question: how demonstration projects are instrumental for enabling new governance model, faster multi-actor engagement, and supported initiatives. You have mentioned a lot about this, but the key issue is that behind this question is how a demonstration project can raise an easy question, annoying questions about the change that we need to do at different level, but also with different sectors. When we have a budget cap, or when we need the private sector to take the lead, we need to demonstrate that in order to move forward with actions that get more a normal practice. So what we are doing is trying to unpack demonstration project as part of a portfolio approach. So it needs to be practical and needs to be guided not only by technology, but also by different type of activities that can enable the connections between the demonstration project and whatever that is happening there. The portfolios of investment, the policy instruments, but also how we create consensus and capacity to go further. A concept that we are doing here is the concept of agency, but the concept of agency in terms of capacity to act. And when we add that, these future-oriented elements, we said, well, you can shape what you have in your hands. You need to navigate with what you don't know, but you still can take decisions. And last but not least, you need to orchestrate every single process and relation all the time. So that's part of something that goes along with the portfolio approach, but also with the human resources that means collaboration between public and private sector, but also, of course, university. I'm going to make it short. So what we are expecting of this kind of demonstration projects, working in different topics, is having this kind of outcomes that facilitate synergies and cross-fertilization between different sectors. And I'm going to give you an example. One of the projects is the one connected to the problems of floods in Valencia last year. You may know about the DANA project that more than 200 people died. So they are focusing in green infrastructure, but how you can think in green infrastructure of the future without thinking in the private sector, and how you can think in not only in the smart services that you need out of that. You can invest in green infrastructure. Who is going to do the green infrastructure? Who is going to maintain the green infrastructure? What is the kind of data that you need? Do you need this to be public driven, or you can use a startup that are more friendly for the kind of emergency issues that need to communicate to people? So all these kind of questions are annoying questions because it means that they are trying to rebalance the responsibilities between the different actors. So because of that, we are trying to generate this kind of overall logic of scaling and influencing the policy through networks. This is happening along with other networks. So the idea is that if we succeed with a simple model, the networks take it as a good practice and create policy alignment with the different actions and the different programs that they are running. So it's a place-based ecosystem approach, and we are very much looking at the enabling conditions for success. What are the capacities that are there and what are the capacities that are not there? Something that happens a couple of years ago, during the pandemic, I was working at the JRC in Brussels in the foresight unit, is that we got an immense, incredible demand of regions and cities. We want to have our foresight unit. We do not want to be dependent anymore on national government. And they thought that that foresight unit should be as part of the government. And I said, well, that's foresight in the 70s. So now the private sector and research can do much better and much faster foresight than the government. So foresight and anticipatory capacity now is systemic. Okay. That capacity still needs to be developed in many different regions because all the regions and all the cities need to have this kind of capacity to anticipate and take decisions. And by doing that, you can explore those opportunities because you can see what you can do to do it today in order to affect the direction of your future. So my question for the panel, in terms of bringing back sustainability trigger innovation, but also trying to see how we move beyond only sustainability and thinking transformation, how to make sustainability trigger innovation more systemic, better at mobilizing diverse sectors, and capable of creating truly transformative approaches. And if you want to know more about what I said, you can download the guide that we recently published. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. I must say I'm going to incorporate into my own life the need to move from footloose to anchored as often as possible. I'd like to start actually by, because that was a very terrifically systemic and somewhat top-down with your spiraling through your quadrant diagram. Oh, that looks nice. Glasses at least, maybe we'll get some water as well. But in the in your talk, you were talking very much, I felt, in a somewhat sort of systemic top-down way, and I was reminded of something Rohinton said to me the other day, and which I think he has said more than once, which is that innovation comes from firms and people. And so I wondered, maybe I could ask you, Rohinton, to start off the response to that talk by a sense of how you see it in terms of top down and bottom up.
Right. Thank you, Oliver. I thought that that Christian's presentation, and in fact the previous session summarizing all the student-led projects, actually encapsulates well what innovation is all about. That, you know, innovation starts with, if I could use the economic term, human capital, but what I really mean is smart people. But they need an environment within which to thrive, and then a system through which those ideas get turned into something we can use. That's really a layperson's definition of innovation. And so, yes, firms trade, firms compete, firms innovate, not people, not countries. It's that in between, but it's still happening in that macro context. If I could, I'd like to make two other points on the question of what's the incentive structure within which firms, and I do believe that now it's mainly firm, you know, the era where someone tinkers in his or her garage or lab and comes up with something and says, Eureka, that's not the way science is happening now. It is much more of an organized, expensive, systematized process. But it has to happen within, number one, a value system. And we haven't talked enough about that. I think it's implicit in what we all do, and especially people who come to conferences like this. We assume that future generations have rights, that we should think about our children and grandchildren, that clean air and clean water is something that isn't taken for granted, but has to be rights-based. And from my world, which is increasingly the tech world, you know, what does the right to privacy, which is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, actually mean in a world where we're constantly being tracked? Just as we want a right to clean air, do we have a right to clean information? And so we have to rethink what our Universal Declaration of Human Rights has to be going forward. And it is from that kind of abstract set of principles that we're going to be able to sort of create sustainable competition and all the other things that we've talked about. The only other point I'd make, and we could come back to it, is I like very much Christian's focus on transformative innovation and complexity. I think these are, again, topics that are abstract. Governments work in silos. You will support, you know, EU or any well-meaning program will have a program in some well-defined science space, but problems straddle these. And so we have to think about how we don't fund nuclear physics. What you want to fund eventually is something that arises from it and that can be applied to improve humanity. And so we have to think about the crosscuts at least as much as the siloed approaches, because the kind of innovation we're now thinking about, and he's quite right to make that point, isn't to turn, you know, 1% measured growth rate to 2% or something. It's much more about changing the way we actually live and think. And I'll just end with two examples of what transformative innovation should now be. AI is said to be threatening jobs. Well, that's because it's threatening jobs as we know them. If we revisit what it means to work and what the labor-leisure trade-off means, so that the human being of the future is not going to think in terms of 8 hours of work and, the balance of rest, then we might be able to get at what that new world looks like. And I'd make the same point about the kinds of things we talk about with sustainability, that it's not about necessarily having to use transport systems the way we've seen them. It's going to be increasingly about shared autonomous systems. It's going to be increasingly about thinking 3 generations ahead. That's what transformation is. It's not to imagine a better today. It's actually to reimagine what tomorrow looks like.
Thank you. Thank you, Anton. That was an inspiring response, and it was very interesting to get the stress on values. Yet we do live in a world in which many people and many investors still see Friedman's model of the firm as having a value of making money so that other people can do their values, is a very prevalent model in my country, in continental Europe, and of course in North America. And I wondered if Barbara might like to make some comments on that and on the role of responsibility when we talk about these values.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. Well, next year, 250 years, Adam Smith, and also birth of the US. So I think we should look into not only the theory of moral sentiments, but also into all his other works. And when it comes to values, but since this is a very academic audience with excellent students and compliments on what you have accomplished with your papers, preparing for this session, I was reminded of the latest Nobel laureates in economics, whether it's Macri or whether it's Aghion and Howitt, who shared the prize together, and what they have to say about innovation and what is relevant when it comes to sustainability triggered innovation. So Macri emphasizes that sustained growth requires not only useful inventions, but also scientific understanding. This is exactly what Rohinton was explaining, how research is set up differently these days than it was in my youth, our youth, when we were at the university and when we started working on those things. And so this is a total different thing. And he also looks into cultural and institutional openness of new ideas. So not this one-size-fits-all models where I have to criticize our European Union central planning ideas, but literally different in what has made Europe great, which was the diversity and the different set of thinking and our different institutions that were all worth. So this is what Macri looks when it comes to innovation. And the other two who shared the prize together, Aghion and Howitt, were looking into the creative destruction model. You might all might have in mind Schumpeter, the great Austrian economist who labeled the term, who coined the term creative destruction. And Aghion and how it looked into a model that formalizes innovation, which is replaced by incumbent firms and technologies. So new entrants displace old ones, of course, because, the old things just go first. And then generating growth in a dynamic. Here we have another economist, Nobel laureate, who was working about dynamism and dynamist processes. So we need both dynamism and competition. But competition again is a discovery process, and without also labeled by another Austrian economist, Hayek. Without this discovery process, we are unable to start up and create those values that we need and that we share. So what is new about those old theories, 250 years, Adam Smith, and then the Austrian school, and now those new Nobel laureates? They look into institutional constraints and the headwinds that we can create out of that. So which means no rigid regulation. That is the thing that we see these days. And vested interests and weak competition and policy barriers. Again, critical that we have seen so far in the EU, and that actually Draghi was also criticizing in his report, and then you, with your idea, Christian, are kind of try to outmaneuver to get those values. And after all, what we need to say is capitalism is the protection of property rights, nothing else. And if we look into those things, and we were one of the groups were using actually you used the example of the floods in Spain. If all our property is destroyed because we cannot protect it, because there is not only money that is missing, but also the values, then we are lost. And I would like to close and provoke you once again with freedom and responsibility, not bureaucracy, unlock innovation, first thing. Second, price signals, not political signals, guide growth. Capital mobility and property rights, as I mentioned, are the key for financing innovation. And we need to create the right incentives. Please keep in mind, our European capital market is literally not a capital market. If we compare it, if we put it in contrast to what we've seen or what we see in Asia and the US. So we could have had an opportunity after Brexit, when London City was kind of going down, and we could have done something in Frankfurt or Paris, nothing had happened. And we lost this opportunity. And until we do not understand that we need venture capital and other forms of investment into the systems, we will not solve it, and our values, again, property rights, responsibility, will be lost out. So the last thing I would like to say is sustainability and property are complementary but governments have to step back. So it's all in our individuals' minds. It's we, with our values, that we need to save and solve this problem. We can't sort it out and to the government. We have to do it ourselves, with hand in hand with enterprises and the old and here again, the old European values that we all share.
Barbara, that again was very stirring. I wonder if I could push you slightly. Why did that capital market why did that not happen? Who should have, I mean, you've just given us a model for how change could happen. Why did that change not happen? And what does that mean for your model?
Well, the first thing, if you look back what Thatcher did, and it was her 100th birthday just last week, she created London City 1.0. And by that, she created a great capital market, and she made sure that there are incentives for people to invest and to generate. There are, unfortunately, too little incentives in Europe to invest. If you look at, we were talking, there are some bankers here and people in the finance industry in the room, how their resources are used these days. Compliance, and not doing the right things in order to generate capital that is efficient and effective. Taxes on capital, taxes on wealth, taxes on heritage, all those things destroy competitiveness or our competitive advantages. Trump has done a lot when it comes to the Genius Act, for example, just if you look at modern forms of financing and a couple of other things. And also he released the power of capital. Whereas unfortunately, we in Europe, we try to regulate it too much. I mean, we know there is need for a certain amount of regulation to live within a frame, that the rule of law is in a certain framework, but that leave it at that and not overdo it.
Cliff, I could see you nodding, but also I suspect you have some other thoughts on this, and then I'm going to come back to Andrea.
Thank you very much. And much has been said already, but I'm going to be very practical about this. And I think as a Brit, I look at
I should say that because Enrico's not here anymore, you're allowed to be practical. It's not necessarily a dirty word
Yeah.
on Saturday morning.
So the EU system for new founders, new organizations, the development and so on, it's absolutely fantastic. It goes through universities, etc. That's really, really good. It is incredibly complicated. The number of different entry points into that EU system is extraordinary. So if you come from, a family where you were in a university and your children go through university and you know this system and you can find your way through the accelerators, that's good. But an awful lot of the best new founded organizations come from migrants, from diversity, from surprises, from women. Now, but in the EU does rather well compared to other countries on women founders. But by saying it's pretty good, it's about 10% total. What about the other 40% to get balance? And the number of people that you're losing at that very early stage. So where do you go if you are not from the university system and the science system and so on? You're doing your new founder through, a bit of money from mum and dad. Where else do you go? Well, there are some programs, it's true, but there is an expectation globally now that if you create a new, interesting company, to get venture capital, the expectation is 10x. Now, 10x works in, it works in the west coast of the USA. There are not enough people to do this. I mean, if you look at
some of the audience may not be in the investment world and may not quite know what you mean by 10.
Venture capital. So I'm meaning, the high risk investment into early stage and growth of a new founder. So what can we actually do if we've got that problem? What can we do? There are sources of funding from really two big places outside of China. One is the west coast of the US, which is tricky at the moment. You may have noticed, and the other is Temasek and all that's happening from Southeast Asia. Just an example of that, Leapfrog started off with it had a little bit of money, but it grew because Temasek said, we will give you $1 billion US. We will give it to you in small tranches so that at each stage, if you're doing well, we'll go to the next tranche, the next tranche, the next tranche. What happens in the EU is you get one tranche. Well, you burn it, or maybe there's a gap, or you have to, it hangs together. So that's a really big possible. Just as a by the way, Leapfrog is now a 6 billion company. It's done very, very well. So what can you do to help? You can use some AI tools. I mean, one that I'm working on is Gifted AI, which is supporting SMEs at the early stage to get to the point where they could get venture capital. We talked actually this was about sustainability. It was a bit of a surprise to me, but there it is. Sustainable finance is, if you include ESG framed finance, that's 30 to 40 trillion US dollars. There's a lot of it. So why aren't we using it for new foundations? That's the big question. Impact investing is a much smaller field, 1.6 trillion. But you probably get further with that 1.6 than you would with the 30. So the practicalities of this are is that there's a lot of pieces of the venture capital opportunity, but they don't connect together. And you really need to know an enormous amount about how the EU works in order to get the money in. That's a problem. That's a real problem. I think it's a solvable problem.
So we can't hear you.
May I just add this?
Of course.
The example of Grimaldi yesterday.
Mhm.
The ship, what is it, container ships.
Mhm.
And they would not get the funding of the EU despite all the tools were produced in Europe, all sustainable tools.
Thank you. Could you just go give that example slightly more for those of us who may not have been in the session yesterday? What was the Grimaldi example? Oh,
I can tell I was actually having the honor of moderating it, so we become more animated. There was a beautiful example. I don't know if he's still with us in the room, Cosimo, but Cosimo was raising a very simple striking complaint. We have 100% of the tech of our ship that is made in Europe. This is local R&D. This is local production. The ship itself, so the hull of the ship, is actually produced in China, not because of our choice, but because 20 years ago, the entire, let's say, shipbuilding basic, let's say, value chain has been delocalized. So now we have not a single chance to produce hull of the boat in Europe. So what we do is that we do everything we can in Europe, except what is not European producible. In that simple case, like we still not eligible for the innovation fund because in our industry, there is simply a regulation, let's call it loophole or gap that prevent us from being European funded or not having everything 100% European based.
right.
Mhm. Just one other piece about this, of course, it's not just about the mechanisms that make it work. It's also the culture that makes it work. And in the US, the idea of putting quite a lot of your family money into a new idea because it might be times, 100,000, 10,000. In the UK, you would get a little bit of that kind of, sort of venture capital approach. And there's some very effective government supports for that. What I see in the EU is caution. It's very thorough caution rather than the US approach, which is we'll take a big bet and maybe we lose a load of money, but it could be fantastic. It's a very different cultural mean.
Andrea, maybe you could come to that from your experiences starting things off.
Yes, I actually like to repeat that terrible word you said. Let's be concrete, even on a Saturday morning. So I thought of coming here like starting from where I am, right? I'm an entrepreneur. I'm in my early 30s. I choose to be in Venice to do innovation. I took 0.0 euros of public funding, and we have raised from the pure private markets over 2 to 3 million euros, let's say, on an approximate term. So maybe I do 3 reflections from that angle. First of all, you will allow me, Holly, you made before the quotation of Milton Friedman, right? The only mission of us entrepreneurs is to make money, make profits. Here I want to add a caveat. I feel every time in history has its own caveats, its own conditions, right? And I think what is clear today is something that was not clear some centuries ago. Yet there is a concrete risk of not having a future. And if we have no future, there is no profit anyway. So I feel that we should draw a line, very clear, that our economic liberalism, our freedom of enterprise should always respect the freedom of a future to exist. So to me, what is going in the direction of nature is not a constraint, is a necessity. Second, I want to give you as a bit of a gift because I'm one of those crazy ones that choose to make a company in Venice. Imagine, right? We go in this city that is just a stage. And I just want to pass you a bit of what I learned by innovating in a place where everyone is just taking pictures or buying gadgets. And I feel that Venice is something you should carry very dear in your hearts when you go back home. This is a place that was rich, crazy rich, filthy rich for centuries. And the reason it was so was not because people were taking pictures selling gadgets, but because innovation was happening. Maybe when you go back home with your Vaporetto, just stop and look on the right-hand side at the arsenal. Inside those walls were the best innovation in sailings, in the coating of boats, but also in the arts, right? The perspective, I would love to make you see the light that was in the paintings of Bellini or Canaletto, right? All of this is the greatness of Venice. Now Europe is at risk of becoming a big, great Venice, a place that is a nice stage, nice talk, and no action. So to me, like what we need to restart is to restart pushing the new generations, my generation, but the one to come, to simply like innovate first, to simply start having their hands dirty and trying to build, make, try, fail, because this is something that we have forgotten in this continent. And Venice is just the example of all of it. So I want you like to come back home and look at this Venetian example of how the future can actually fail if we start daring and creating. And probably I'm becoming too long, so keep the third point for later.
No.
You know, with
Now, there's not much later. There's a concrete risk of no later at all. If we start the next, so please take the third
with the
point.
beautiful climax. Allow me, Ollie. I'll do it later, and so like we will continue even offline in a coffee chat. But, glad to be with you.
Christian, how do you feel about what you've heard as response to your discussion?
I find very attractive because I'm surrounded by economists, and I think this is kind of very unusual in my recent life. So I just trying to translate what they said in terms of what I understand. I found very attractive the discussion about the discussion on investment and instruments and business model, but also the use of AI. And something that comes to my mind is a discussion that we are having about what is the difference between being innovative, even at the industrial sector, in developing new technologies or in adopting new technologies in terms of market development or even incorporating new technologies in our sectors. And one of the discussions that we are having is on what is the somehow a little bit abstract, but the transition between Industry 4.0, that is efficiency and profit seeking, and Industry 5.0, that should be sustainable, resilient, and human-centric. And the AI comes there. We are not going to lead on development of AI, but might be our ecosystems could be very successful in incorporating AI. But in which sectors? Are we trying to invest in putting AI everywhere, where we can be competitive? So obviously there are some kind of winners, and this is kind of the thing that comes to my mind, where we use all these instruments, where we, in Europe in particular, where we are going to invest. Are we going to select, for example, pharmaceutical or kind of the chemistry or food system? Are those sectors the ones that have more potential to be sustainable and having leadership and create new jobs? Because if we bring AI to everything, it might be that we do not channel the right type of efforts in terms of creating the difference. So for me, the question in terms of the discussion that we are having here is this kind of long-term future about like, what is the pathway for being competitiveness in terms of which industry? And all these kind of early stage type of activities are part of a pathway to go to somewhere. But some of the industries might succeed, some of them not. And in terms of the global situation, we might need to be more strategic about that. That's kind of my reflection about how all this fit in terms of which direction and which sectors.
Thank you. I think that I want to turn to Rohit and then Barbara for just some last thoughts in the last few minutes.
I almost had a sort of hot pursuit thought, which is why I flagged my finger. The distinction that was just made between innovation and adoption is worth thinking about, and brings me to my other sort of favorite bugbear, which is the intellectual property system we have. Innovation is about doing something and then owning it, or at least controlling it. Adoption, smart as it might be, is about taking someone else's ownership and then making the best of it. Why does that matter? Number one, if you simply statistically say that all human beings are equal and all of that, then innovation should be happening evenly around the world. If it isn't, it's a failure of your education or some other human development system. So, why shouldn't there be an Einstein in Africa and so on? So that's one sort of very fundamental point. The other one is a practical one. And I think if I had a slide, I often have a slide that's a pie chart of the value composition of a smartphone. And this is something WIPO did some years ago. Something like 2/3 to 3/4, maybe even 80% of the value of a smartphone is branding, is intangible. Branding, intellectual property. The rest, the 20-ish%, is materials and labor. So when someone says, comparative advantage, concentrate on what you do best, you might be limiting yourself to the 20% and not the 80%, because the 80% is not evident. That's why adoption, although it's a smart thing to do in the short run, is not a smart thing to do in the long run. Because what you're doing is buying someone else's 80% wealth and sort of making the best of it with your raw materials and your labor. Final point, since you mentioned beautiful Venice, maybe I'll put it in our chat. There's a very nice article in today's New York Times, and you all know this better than I would, of how tourism has gone overboard in Italy. And they mention Venice, Palermo, Firenze, where, cities have now banned more restaurants opening on certain streets because the whole street has been transformed into a kitschy restaurant row that sells spritzers and a certain kind of spaghetti that the tourists, the cruise ship tourists want. And that completely destroys the diversity and the values and culture and the local flavor. So comparative advantage in the static sense will give you that. Comparative advantage in what we call the dynamic sense, which completely fits into Barbara's views of Adam Smith and economic principles, requires you to think ahead. And that requires some kind of risk-taking and capacity for failure, which one of you mentioned, which sometimes we don't tolerate in our governments because we don't trust them. But we need that to think ahead and not simply dig deeper in what we do now, because then you'll end up with that main street in Palermo that this article talks about.
Barbara.
Thank you, Rohinton. Christian, you mentioned AI as kind of and also Cliff as a driver. But again, I have to take a step back, and sorry for doing that, but we have to criticize or at least look critically at what is being done in Brussels. Again, AI regulation. We were the first ones across the world to really put a severe structure on AI, how it should work, whereas the rest of the world is kind of floating and doing it around everything and experimenting, and we give strict rules, and we do not, by that, will not allow investors to set up companies in Europe to become great and successful here, because we just we don't allow this form of competition there. So how will we be innovative, at least in that field, if we kind of close competition down and shut it down? So we are shooting ourselves in one leg, or maybe in both at the same time. So we have to view this very critical and tell politics, maybe you should step out of that field, take a step back and not intervene everywhere. Just look, because the idea is all great. We need to protect our consumers, but we need to, I would rather look at the other way. All our consumers are capable of thinking and acting for themselves and making their own decisions. After all, we still have our brains and have not lost everything to those nice little tools. So maybe we should also, and being a politician now, I take this message to my fellow politicians and say, no, don't overregulate. And look at what Andrea, thank you very much for putting that so nicely, what Venice and all the city-states in Italy or in Germany or the Hanseatic League or all those merchant cities have done across the world. They created, they were innovative. And with that innovation, they created where this was the basics for our wealth. And with the wealth, we trade, and this makes us successful.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And thank you very much for a very stimulating panel. Definitely as good as having another cup of coffee. And it's very nice to have politicians and thinkers and entrepreneurs and analysts all talking together in this way. I think it's an excellent way to come to the end of the discussion. But I do have to end the discussion at this point because it is time for the next plenary. In fact, more than time. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
I used to be, it was popular, but
What is your economist? All economists.
I'm an economist.
Very shortly. Olga, some